He was not a beggar. Chloe knew that the second he paused under the flickering neon of the cafe's sign, a ghost caught in a crimson tide. Beggars in this part of the city had a practiced weariness, a hollowed-out look that was both a plea and a defense. This man was different. His clothes, a simple dark coat and trousers, were clean but hung on his frame like a memory of a larger man. It was his hands that held her gaze. They trembled with a fine, persistent tremor, the skin thin as parchment over a lattice of blue veins. He clutched the wrought iron railing of the patio, his knuckles white, as if the last of his strength was dedicated to that single point of contact with the world. The late afternoon rain had slicked the streets into a mirror of bruised twilight, and the old man seemed to have absorbed the city's entire reservoir of sorrow. Chloe watched from behind the steamy glass of the diner, a damp cloth frozen in her hand. Her boss, a man whose patience was as thin as his coffee, was already eyeing the door with predatory annoyance. "Don't even think about it, Chloe," he grumbled, wiping the counter with a vicious swipe. "We're not a shelter," but she was already moving. It wasn't a thought, but an impulse, a deep, resonant hum of empathy that vibrated in her bones. She was 18, and the world had already taught her that kindness was a currency she couldn't afford to spend, yet here she was, ready to empty her pockets. She grabbed a bowl, ladling it full of the day-old potato soup that was destined for the bin. She took a spoon and a napkin, slid a bread roll into her apron pocket, and pushed through the door into the damp, chilly air. The old man flinched at the chime of the bell, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed ancient. He was Korean, his face a roadmap of a long and complicated journey, but his eyes were lost. "Sir," she said, her voice softer than the drizzle. "Are you hungry?" He didn't answer, only stared at her, his breathing shallow. She gestured to a small, empty table under the awning, shielded from the worst of the rain. "Please, seat. Let me get you something warm." He followed her with hesitant, shuffling steps, his body a fragile question mark against the city's indifferent geometry. He sank into the chair, the movement exhausting him. Chloe placed the soup before him. He looked at the bowl, then at the spoon, and his trembling hands made a failed attempt to grasp it. A wave of profound sadness washed over Chloe. She pulled up another chair, her worn sneakers scraping softly on the wet pavement. "Here," she whispered, taking the spoon herself. "Let me help." She dipped the spoon into the thick soup and brought it to his lips. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his gaze searching hers, and in that moment, she saw not a stranger, but a reflection of every quiet desperation she had ever felt. He opened his mouth, and she fed him. Spoonful by spoonful, in the hushed theater of the rain-swept patio, an act of simple grace unfolded, a secret whispered between two souls adrift in the vast, uncaring metropolis. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. She only knew he was hungry, and she had food. 2 days passed, a blur of lukewarm coffee and meager tips. The memory of the old man lingered like the scent of rain on asphalt, a quiet disturbance in the rhythm of her life. Then, on a Tuesday when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a car slid to the curb outside the cafe. It was a black sedan, so polished and silent it seemed to have absorbed the city's noise. It didn't belong on this street of peeling paint and weary storefronts. A man emerged from the passenger side. He was tall and broad, dressed in a suit so sharply tailored it looked like a weapon. His face was impassive, a mask of disciplined stillness, but his eyes missed nothing. They swept over the cafe's exterior before he entered, the bell above the door sounding a note of alarm. He didn't approach the counter. He stood by the entrance, a granite pillar of quiet menace, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. Chloe felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. Her boss tried a greasy, welcoming smile. "Table for one?" The man's gaze settled on Chloe, pinning her in place. "I am looking for information," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, English words shaped by a Korean tongue. "An old man. He was here 2 days ago." It wasn't a question. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the old man's fearful eyes, his trembling hands. This man was not a concerned relative. He was a hunter. "I don't know who you mean," she said, her voice tight. "We get a lot of people in here." The man took a slow step forward, his polished shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum. He moved with a predatory grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "She fed him," he said, his eyes still locked on hers. "With a spoon." Outside, he knew. The knowledge hung in the air between them, a tangible threat. Chloe clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She wouldn't be the reason that fragile old man was found. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a strength she didn't feel into her voice. "You're mistaken." The man held her gaze for a long, silent moment, a contest of wills she knew she couldn't win. Then, a flicker of something, not respect, but perhaps acknowledgement, passed through his eyes. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he produced a wallet. He extracted a single, crisp $100 bill and placed it on the counter. It lay there, an insult and a promise. "For your trouble," he said, the words flat and final. He turned and walked out, melting back into the silent, waiting car. The sedan pulled away from the curb as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the scent of expensive leather and a profound, chilling dread. The $100 bill sat in her pocket all day, a square of heat against her leg. It felt heavy, tainted. It was more than she made in 3 shifts, a fortune that could fix the leak in her ceiling or buy the medicine her grandmother needed, but accepting it felt like a betrayal. When her shift ended, she walked out into the cool embrace of the evening, the city lights beginning to stitch the darkness together. The black sedan was there, parked across the street, a patient predator in the urban jungle. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized her. She thought about running, about disappearing into the labyrinth of alleyways and side streets she knew so well. But a deeper instinct told her it would be useless. The rear door opened. The imposing man from the cafe, Sang-hoon, stood beside it, his silhouette framed by the car's opulent interior. "Chloe," he said. Her name from his lips sounded like a verdict. "Mr. Park wishes to see you." It was a command disguised as an invitation. There was no room for refusal in his tone. Her mind raced, a frantic catalogue of fears. Was she in trouble? Was this about the old man? Was he hurt? Her protective instinct warred with her survival instinct. Sang-hoon seemed to read her thoughts. "He wishes only to thank you." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they carried the weight of an unbreakable obligation. Swallowing the metallic taste of fear, she crossed the street. The simple act felt like crossing a border into another country, one with different rules and a language she didn't understand. She slid into the back of the car. The door closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing her in. The interior was a world of soft leather and polished wood, silent and climate-controlled, a hermetic bubble moving through the gritty reality of her neighborhood. The city she knew, the symphony of sirens, shouting, and distant music, vanished, replaced by a low, powerful hum. They drove in silence, the city lights smearing into ribbons of neon and gold through the tinted windows. They moved from the familiar territory of cracked pavement and brick tenements into a realm of gleaming glass towers that scraped the belly of the night sky. Each block was a step further away from her life, from everything she was. The car descended into a private underground garage, the silence growing deeper, more profound. Sang-hoon led her to a private elevator, which ascended with a smooth, silent rush that made her stomach drop. She felt like she was rising to an execution or an coronation, and she couldn't tell which was more terrifying. The doors opened directly into a penthouse apartment. The view hit her first, a breathtaking, godlike panorama of the entire city, a sprawling galaxy of lights laid out at her feet. It was the world, seen from a place of impossible power. And in the center of it all, a man stood waiting for her. He turned from the floor-to-ceiling window as she entered, and the first thing she noticed was his stillness. Where Sang-hoon was a coiled spring of physical power, this man possessed a different kind of gravity. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with threads of silver at his temples and eyes that held a deep, weary intelligence. He wore a simple, dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, the picture of understated wealth. This was Mr. Park. Dae-hyun Park. He was not what she expected. There was a gentleness in his posture that seemed at odds with the silent menace of his enforcer and the fortress-like luxury of his home. "Miss Chloe," he said, his voice a calm, cultured baritone. He gestured to a pair of plush armchairs. "Please sit." "Thank you for coming." She sat on the edge of the cushion, her body rigid with tension. Sang-hoon remained standing by the door, a silent, watchful statue. Dae-hyun sat opposite her, his movements fluid and deliberate. "Sang-hoon can be direct," he began, a faint, apologetic smile touching his lips. "I apologize if he alarmed you. It was not my intention." Chloe found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "The old man. Is he all right?" A flicker of genuine warmth entered Dae-hyun's eyes. "He is. He is my father, Min-jun. He has a condition that sometimes makes him wander. He gets lost in the past. We have caregivers, but he is clever." He slipped away. The simple, domestic explanation felt jarringly out of place in this environment of cold power. "Your kindness to him," Dae-hyun continued, his gaze intense, "in a city that so often shows none. It was a remarkable thing. You treated him with dignity when he had none himself. You showed him a grace my money cannot buy." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I am in your debt. I would like to repay you." He gestured to a small, lacquered box on the table between them. He opened it. Inside, neat stacks of $100 bills were nestled in velvet. It was more money than Chloe had ever seen in her life. Enough to solve every problem she had, and every problem she could imagine having. It was an escape, a new beginning. Her heart pounded, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The temptation was immense, a physical pull. But as she looked at the money, she saw the old man's face, his lost and trusting eyes. She thought of the simple warmth of the soup, the quiet connection they had shared. That moment had been clean, pure. This money felt like a transaction, a way to sterilize the memory, to file it away as a debt paid. "No," she said, the word soft but firm. Her own voice surprised her. "Thank you, but I can't take that." Dae-hyun's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Sang-hoon shifted his weight by the door, a minute adjustment that betrayed his own shock. "Why?" Dae-hyun asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Chloe looked at him directly, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a simple, unshakable conviction. "I didn't do it for money. He was hungry. That's all." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant, muted hum of the city below. Dae-hyun studied her, his gaze analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. He had built an empire on the predictable levers of human behavior: greed, fear, ambition. Her refusal, her simple, unadorned sincerity, was an anomaly he could not easily categorize. He closed the lid of the lacquered box, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. "You are a very unusual young woman, Chloe." He leaned back in his chair, a new line of thought visibly forming behind his eyes. The dynamic in the room had shifted. She was no longer just a waitress he was paying off. She had become something more interesting to him. "The money is a clumsy instrument," he conceded, as if speaking to himself. "It solves certain problems, but it cannot mend what is broken. My father, he responds to very few people. The nurses, the doctors, they are professionals. They are paid to care. But you offered him something else." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards the sprawling city that was his kingdom. "He has been asking for the kind girl with the warm soup." The words struck Chloe with unexpected force, a small, perfect arrow of warmth in the cold, intimidating space. The old man remember her. Dae-hyun turned his attention back to her, his expression now one of focused purpose. "I would like to make you a different kind of offer. Not a reward, but a proposition. A job." Chloe waited, her breath held tight in her chest. "I want you to be a companion for my father," he said. "A few hours a day, perhaps 4 or 5 times a week. You would talk to him, read to him, perhaps share a meal. You would simply be there. Your presence calms him. The offer was a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of her life. It meant escaping the cafe, her leering boss, the constant, grinding anxiety of poverty. But it also meant stepping deeper into this world, a world of silent cars, intimidating men, and secrets that felt as vast and dangerous as the city itself. The position would, of course, be well compensated, Dae-hyun added, naming a weekly salary that made her gasp. It was an absurd, life-altering amount of money. It was too much. Why me? She asked, the question hanging in the air. There are professionals, people train for this. Because you are not a professional, he answered immediately. You are not trained. You have something they don't. You have an instinct for compassion that is genuine. My father trusts that instinct. And frankly, he added, a harder edge creeping into his voice, so do I. I need someone in this house whose motives are clear. Someone who is not a part of my world. The implication was clear. His world was filled with people whose motives were not. She was being offered a role as an outsider on the inside, a safe port in a sea of sharks. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a different feeling was stirring, a sense of possibility, a chance to do something that mattered, and to save herself in the process. She looked from Dae-hyun's waiting eyes to Sang-hoon's impassive face, and then she thought of the old man, and the choice became clear. Okay, she said. I'll do it. Chloe's new life began the next day. It felt less like starting a job and more like being inducted into a secret society. Sang-hoon would pick her up in a silent black car, and the daily journey from her world to theirs became a ritual of decompression and transformation. As the sedan ascended towards the penthouse, she would consciously shed the anxieties of her old life, preparing herself for the quiet, rarefied air of the park's home. The penthouse was a museum of tasteful, minimalist luxury, but it was Min-jun's presence that filled it. The old man was often quiet, seated in a comfortable chair by the window, watching the endless ballet of traffic below. Some days he was lucid, his eyes sharp and clear. On those days, he would speak of his childhood in a small village by the sea, of the persimmon trees and the taste of his mother's kimchi. He taught her a few words of Korean and showed her how to play Go, his trembling hands moving the smooth black and white stones with a surprising, remembered grace. On other days, the fog of his condition would roll in, and he would be lost, speaking to ghosts from his past or staring at his hands as if they were foreign objects. On those days, Chloe would simply sit with him, sometimes reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice a steady anchor in his turbulent mind. She learned to navigate his silences, to understand the language of his sighs and the flicker of his eyes. She was a companion, yes, but she was also a student of this quiet, fragmented man. In her time there, she also became an observer of his son. Dae-hyun was often present but distant, working in his study, the door usually closed. She would catch glimpses of his other life, the hushed, intense phone calls in rapid-fire Korean, the arrival of serious-looking men who spoke in low tones and never stayed long. The way Sang-hoon was a constant, shadow-like presence, his eyes always scanning, assessing. She learned that Dae-hyun's politeness was a carefully constructed veneer over a core of absolute authority. Men who were powerful in their own right deferred to him with a deference that bordered on fear. One afternoon, while Min-jun napped, she overheard Dae-hyun in the hallway, his voice dangerously low as he spoke on the phone. Kwon is making a move on the waterfront. I want to know how. I want to know who is talking to him. The name, Kwon, was spoken with a unique blend of frustration and cold fury. It was a name she heard again a week later, this time from Sang-hoon, who was reporting to Dae-hyun in the foyer. Kwon's people are getting bold. They approached one of our distributors. Dae-hyun's only response was a quiet, handle it. The next day, there was a small article buried in the back of the business section about a sudden, unexplained restructuring at a major shipping terminal. Chloe connected the dots. This wasn't just a family business. It was an empire, and it was at war. She was living in the calm, quiet eye of a storm, a privileged guest in a king's court, and she was beginning to understand that the price of this peace was a violence she could only guess at. One rainy afternoon, Chloe was helping Minjun sort through a box of old keepsakes, a task he'd requested in a rare moment of focused nostalgia. The box smelled of cedar and thyme. Inside were medals, faded letters, and stacks of photographs bound with twine. As she untied one of the bundles, a loose picture slid out and fell to the floor, landing face up. She picked it up. It was a black and white photo of three young men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, laughing under a blossoming cherry tree. One was a much younger, beaming Minjun. Another was a teenage Daehyun, his face still unlined by the burdens of power, but with the same intense eyes. The third man was handsome and sharp-featured, his smile wide and confident. They looked like a family, a father, a son, and a favored uncle or older brother. She held it out to Minjun. "Who is this?" she asked gently, pointing to the third man. Minjun took the photograph, his trembling fingers tracing the stranger's face. The fog in his eyes seemed to part for a moment, replaced by a flash of startling, painful clarity. His expression darkened, the memory twisting his features into a mask of grief and betrayal. "Kwon," he whispered, the name a ragged exhalation. He looked at Chloe, his eyes pleading, as if he needed her to understand the weight of this history. "He broke the promise," he said, his voice cracking. "The Brotherhood. He broke it for nothing," before she could ask more. The light in his eyes faded, and he retreated back into the mists of his confusion, looking at the photograph as if he'd never seen it before. Later that evening, as she was preparing to leave, Daehyun came out of his study. He saw the photograph, which she had left on the side table. He froze. The polite mask fell away, and for a second, she saw the raw, unguarded pain on his face. He picked up the picture, his thumb brushing over Kwon's smiling image. "My father showed you this?" he asked, his voice tight. Chloe nodded. He said, Kwon broke a promise. Daehyun stared at the photograph for a long moment, the silence in the room growing heavy. He seemed to be making a decision. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a history she was only now beginning to comprehend. "Kwon was my father's sworn brother," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "They built this organization together, from nothing. They took different paths. My father believed in rules, in a code. Kwon came to believe only in profit. He wanted to move into businesses my father refused, drugs, human trafficking. When my father would not yield, Kwon tried to take everything. He failed, and he was exiled. Now he has returned, and he wants to finish what he started. He wants to burn it all to the ground. Simply because my father built it, he placed the photograph back on the table, face down. You are in this house now, Chloe. That means you are on the board. Whether you want to be or not, you are a piece in this game. You should know the name of the man who is trying to sweep you from it. The knowledge changed everything. The quiet luxury of the penthouse now felt fragile, the floor-to-ceiling windows less like a viewpoint and more like a vulnerability. Every shadow seemed longer, every unexpected sound a potential threat. Kwon was no longer just a name. He was a phantom haunting the periphery of her new life. Daehyun became more withdrawn, the tension around him a palpable force. The war with Kwon was escalating. Chloe could feel it in the increased presence of grim-faced men in the lobby and the constant, low-level hum of activity that now permeated the penthouse. One evening, as Sang-hoon drove her home, he took a different route. "There will be a car watching your building," he said, his voice flat, not looking at her. "They will not approach. They are for your protection." Protection from what? The unspoken question hung between them. The answer came 2 days later. Chloe was walking the short block from the subway to her apartment when a man stepped out of a doorway, blocking her path. He was not physically imposing like Sang-hoon, but he had the same predatory stillness she had seen in Kwon's photograph, updated with 2 decades of bitterness. He was older, his hair graying, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Chloe," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "It's a pleasure to finally meet the angel of mercy." It was Kwon. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. Her feet felt rooted to the cracked pavement. "I don't know who you are," she lied, her voice trembling. He smiled, a thin, Humorless expression. Oh, I think you do. Dae-hyun keeps you so close.
A pet.
A project. A weakness. He took a step closer, invading her space. He thinks his father's old ways can survive in this new world.
Honor.
Loyalty. He fills his fortress with them. But he leaves the gate open. You are the open gate. Little bird, his words were calm, almost conversational, but they were laced with deadly intent. He was using her, probing Dae-hyun's defenses. Before she could react, a car screeched around the corner. Sang-hoon was out before it stopped moving, a dark, furious blur of motion. Kwon didn't flinch. He simply gave Chloe another thin smile. Tell Dae-hyun that sentiment is a luxury he can no longer afford, he said, then turned and vanished into the labyrinth of the city as quickly as he had appeared. The confrontation came to a head a week later. Not in an alley, but in the sterile, neutral territory of a high-end restaurant, closed to the public. Dae-hyun had arranged a meeting. Sang-hoon had insisted Chloe stay in the penthouse, but Dae-hyun had overruled him. She's a part of this now, he'd said. Kwon made her a part. She will see it end. She sat at a small, separate table, a silent witness. Dae-hyun and Kwon sat opposite each other, the space between them charged with decades of shared history and betrayal. This ends tonight, Kwon, Dae-hyun said, his voice calm. Kwon laughed. It does. But not for me. You've grown soft, Dae-hyun. Hiding in your tower with your broken father and your charity case, he nodded towards Chloe. She is the proof. Your father's sentimentality, his fatal flaw, lives on in you. You care what she thinks. That is why you will lose, Dae-hyun's jaw tightened. Chloe watched them, her heart pounding. Kwon was goading him, trying to provoke him into a rash action. But then she looked at Kwon, truly looked at him, and saw past the confident facade. She saw the ghost of the young man in the photograph. She remembered Minjun's words. He broke it for nothing, and in a moment of terrifying clarity, she understood. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about power. It was about the broken brotherhood. She stood up. Both men turned to look at her, surprised. He misses you, she said, her voice clear and steady, directed at Kwon. Mr. Park. Minyoon. He doesn't talk about the business. He talks about the persimmon trees. He talks about his brother. Kwon's smirk faltered. A flicker of confusion, of pain, crossed his face. He keeps your picture. Chloe pressed on, the words tumbling out. He told me you broke the promise. He didn't sound angry. He just sounded.
Sut.
He lost his brother for nothing. Her simple, earnest words did what no threat from Dae-hyun could. They bypassed Kwon's strategic mind and struck at the wounded core of the man he once was. The foundation of his rage, his belief that he had been wronged, was shaken by the simple, undeniable truth of an old man's grief. Kwon stared at Chloe, his composure shattered. For a fleeting moment, the calculating rival was gone, replaced by the young man in the photograph, caught in the headlights of a past he could not outrun. Her words hadn't been a strategy. They were the truth, and their emotional honesty was a weapon he had no defense against. He had built his entire campaign of revenge on the narrative that Minjun and Dae-hyun had betrayed him, had cast him out for their own ambition. Chloe's revelation, that the old man's primary memory of him was one of fraternal loss, not business rivalry, undermined the very premise of his war. Dae-hyun saw the opening, the crack in Kwon's armor. He didn't press the attack with threats or violence. He leaned forward, his voice low and devoid of triumph. It was never about the money, was it, Kwon? It was about his approval. And you threw away the one thing he ever wanted from you. Your loyalty. Kwon looked from Dae-hyun's steady gaze to Chloe's compassionate one, and something inside him seemed to collapse. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. He had waged a war for decades, fueled by a grievance that, he was just now realizing, was largely of his own making. He had become the villain in his own story. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. He stood, no longer a formidable rival, but just an old, tired man. He walked out of the restaurant without another word, leaving his empire, his revenge, and his past behind him on the table. The silence he left was heavier than the tension that had preceded it. Sang-hoon, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. He looked at Chloe, and for the first time, she saw clear and undisguised respect in his eyes. He gave her a short, formal bow. Dae-hyun let out a long, slow breath, the tension of years seeming to drain from his shoulders. "You did what an army of my men could not," he said to Chloe, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. You reminded him of who he used to be. The immediate danger had passed. The war was over. Later that night, back in the quiet of the penthouse, Dae-hyun stood with her by the window, the city lights as silent, glittering testament to his victory. "You are free to go, Chloe," he said softly. "Kwon is gone. The threat is gone. I will give you what I promised, enough to start a new life, to go anywhere, to be anything you want. You have more than earned it." He was offering her an exit, a return to a normal life, albeit a much wealthier one. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. But as she looked out at the city, she realized the view no longer intimidated her. She wasn't just the girl from the struggling neighborhood anymore. She had faced down one of the most dangerous men in the city with nothing but a few honest words. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. 6 months later, the city was draped in the crisp, golden light of autumn. Chloe sat in a university library, a heavy textbook on urban planning open before her. The quiet murmur of students, the scent of old paper and ambition, was the new soundtrack of her life. She looked different. The weary tension that had perpetually hunched her shoulders was gone, replaced by a calm confidence. She had accepted Dae-hyun's offer, but not all of it. She took enough for tuition and a small, sunny apartment in a safe neighborhood, a world away from both her old life and his. The rest, she had insisted, he put into a trust for his father's care. Her life was her own now, built not on a handout, but on a foundation she had laid herself. She still thought of them sometimes. She wondered how Min-jun was, if he ever asked for her. She thought of Dae-hyun, a king in his glass tower, and hoped he had found some measure of peace in his victory. She had chosen to walk away, to reclaim her own story from the pages of theirs. As she was packing her bag to leave, a campus mail attendant approached her. "Package for you, miss." It was a small, plain cardboard box with no return address. Curious, she took it to a bench outside, the autumn leaves crunching under her feet. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. It was a sparrow, its head cocked with a curious, lifelike energy. The detail was remarkable, each tiny feather etched with painstaking care. She knew instantly who had carved it. She remembered Min-jun sitting by the window for hours with a small block of basswood and a whittling knife, his trembling hands growing steady and sure as he worked, coaxing life from the inanimate object. It was the only thing his mind never lost. There was a small, folded card at the bottom of the box. She opened it. There were no words of thanks, no grand pronouncements. Just a single, perfectly rendered character in black ink, written with a confident, calligraphic hand. She didn't know much Korean, but she remembered this character. Min-jun had taught it to her during one of their lessons. It meant family. A tear slid down her cheek, a drop of warmth in the cool autumn air. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of gratitude. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet thread of connection that stretched across the city, from a penthouse in the sky to a girl on a campus bench. It was a promise that even in the vast, anonymous sprawl of the city, acts of kindness mattered. They echoed. They endured. Chloe closed her hand around the small wooden bird, its polished surface smooth and warm against her palm. She looked up at the endless sky, the setting sun painting the clouds in shades of orange and rose. The city wasn't a monster to be feared anymore. It was just a place, full of broken and beautiful things, and she had found her own place within it, not as a victim of its currents, but as a quiet architect of her own hopeful future.